Why do you keep fighting?
There's a tempest in me.
You have fought long enough, Galadriel. Put up your sword.
Without it, what might it be?
Hey, Jennifer Walden here from Mix's 2023 Emmy Awards season virtual event. We're talking about the sound on Amazon Prime Video's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, episode 106, Udûn. Joining me are supervising sound editors Damian Del Borrello and Robert Stambler. So congratulations, guys. This is your first Emmy nomination. How cool is that? And for Lord of the Rings, couldn't be better.
Yeah, we don't expect things like this, but when they happen, it's really rewarding, and we're just so honored to be considered.
Absolutely, yeah. It was 2.5 years of our lives. It was a long journey. So it was. It's a real delight to have that recognition.
The series was such a delight to watch. I mean, it's so epic. This season that we're talking about, 106, Udûn, this episode is action-packed. I mean, you have orcs storming the elven fortress. You have Arondir, the elf, bringing the tower down on them. There's the battle of the orcs against the human Southlanders. There's the eruption of Mount Doom. I mean, there's so much to cover sound-wise. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is the orcs. Like, how did you handle the voices for the orcs? And then, of course, how did you expand that into the group of orcs chanting before they stormed the fortress, and then all of the orc group Walla during the battles?
By the time this episode came around, we had already pretty solidified what the orcs should sound like. So now it was about, bringing them to their sort of most menacing, most extreme, strongest, agitated, version of that. And, the sort of brief for the orcs from the get-go was to make them feel not of this world, not fit for this world of Middle-earth, sickly, like they don't like clean air, and they rather be in a ash-ridden environment, than clean, healthy life, and just making them feel uncomfortable in their skin. And so, I mean, really just building upon what we had established in previous episodes, and working with really talented loop group. I mean, Stephanie Yang and Ray, worked together to record dozens and dozens of actors that were all bringing full on, performances to it with the direction of kind of what we were just talking about. And then, of course, you get it in the recording and you want more, and, you would augment it with animalistic stuff. There's a moment in this episode where there's a room full of orcs and a room full of humans in a quiet room together, just coexisting while this very intimate, intense dialogue is happening. And just arriving at the sort of sound of 24 breathing orcs after they just ran 6 miles, sitting there and breathing uncomfortably next to, women and children, and that sort of juxtaposition. There was a lot to do with the orcs in this episode overall.
Yeah, one thing worth mentioning is so the orcs looked amazing, right? They had the armor, they had all the prosthetics, but they had these prosthetic teeth, right? Which meant that their actual dialogue, the words that they were saying, like with the treatment that we wanted to do, which was quite a simple pitching to kind of put it more in the large physicality of their bodies, it meant that we would lose intelligibility when we did any sort of processing. I mean, even the raw production tracks were a little bit unclear. So as Robbie mentioned, our dialogue supervisor, Steph Ung, worked with Ray Benjis, who's an awesome ADR supervisor and editor, and re-recorded every single piece of orc dialogue so that we had a high resolution, 96K recording of every single piece of dialogue so that we can do the pitching. And it was sort of, quite subtle, but it was just enough to sort of change it from like a a human to that sort of otherworldly kind of sound that Robbie was describing. And so that was across the entire season. So it was a monumental job. And then that also translated to the groups as well. So all of the crowds needed a little bit of extra pitching to make them sound different to the crowds of the Southlanders, apart from the performance, obviously, but the actual tone of the voice. Yeah, so it was a lot of work there.
and you can't talk about the subject without mentioning Bear McCreary. So the actual song that the orcs are chanting, it weaves in and out of like existing in the scene, and then it kind of becomes score. And Bear actually recorded a choir singing Nampot, which is what they're chanting. And so we had these really cool moments where it's all our orcs that we recorded, our group, Nampot, and multiplied and staggered and stretched to create the illusion of much larger numbers than we actually had to record. And then we bring in Bear's musical Nampot. And what was funny, I will never forget, we soloed the musical Nampot section and hit play, and it was like Orc the Musical. It was amazing. They're chanting.
Funny.
Full on, like, beautiful studio Nampot. But
fantastic singers
with the processed material that had all that echo and real world verb and vibe put on top. It created that through line through that sequence.
We were actually quite fortunate with that sequence specifically. We had that turned over to us quite early. Charlotte, the director of that episode, was quite into collaborating with the sound department early on. So we had all of that as a pretty advanced version turned over to us, and we went to town on it and then gave those tracks back to the picture editorial, and they kept kind of refining the edit. But those rhythms of the marching and the chanting, that was all sort of established very early on, which then fed into the music recording and actually I didn't talk to Bear about it, but I'm sure he got inspired by that rhythm and then wrote that amazing piece of music.
Oh, it was absolutely a conversation between Bear and I about syncing up for that. And then masterfully mixed by Lindsay.
Well done, because the handoff is just amazing. And I want to see Orcs the musical. I'm totally interested in that. So during the battle between the orcs and the humans, the Numenorians show up to the fight. How did you change the sound of the battle to kind of reflect the inclusion of these more skilled warriors?
Again, tricky because you're dealing with an entirely ADR environment. There's no production dialogue from that entire reel of that episode. I feel like, there's probably somewhere in there, but so you need to manufacture this humanoid, army, and then this kind of non-humanoid orc army, and like you said, they need to coexist. It really came through performances, and we made sure that the orc material didn't feel like the human stuff. And then it was about really from shot to shot, really focusing in on who we should be hearing and what perspective are they and where are they panned on the screen. And then also creating the arc of the story of the battle, like who's winning at any given moment, and really favoring the orc side over a few shots than the human side. And I know it's not the dialogue, but another discerning element between those two armies are the weapons. So we had the direction from the showrunners that, the elven weapons need to be incredibly well made and articulate, and like the most high-tech weapons wielded by extremely, skilled craftsmen who made it, the whole deal. And the orcs could be like rusty and brute force and nasty and not quite as sharp. And we would take those things and work them into the prop sounds. And that definitely helped us as well.
Yeah, we had an awesome loop group editor, Gareth Van Niekerk. He did all of the crowds for the whole season. And just as Robbie mentioned, like all of that specific, when you see something specific in the distance or in the foreground, like all of that detail in the crowds, as well as all of the detail in the sound effects with the swords. We worked very closely with our Foley team, and we before they even recorded, we would export just a work in progress sound effects bounce to them, and they would use that as the starting point for their records. So then they would identify things that maybe didn't need a lot of coverage, but then other things that would, maybe we had the low end, and then they would build in sort of high frequency sort of components and mid range detail. And then by the time they'd finished recording and edited, everything was just perfectly lined up, perfectly full range sounds. So that was another huge part of the sound of battles in general, but also taking it a step further, pushing that all onto the stage with the music and the dialogue, and the way that everything was mixed and weaved in and out of those. Because if you wall to wall sound effects, like, it's too much, and it's often disorienting because the cuts are so quick. And you're seeing lots of different things in a very short period of time. Like Robbie was saying, like when to favor the Orcs, when to favor the Numenorians, but what part of the soundtrack actually does that better? Is it the music, or is it sound effects, or is it the crowds and the dialogue? So credit to Bo Borders and Lindsay Alvarez, our mixers, because they really made that sequence super crystal clear, but also really big impact. It was incredibly cinematic.
Yeah. So I want to spend the last half of this conversation talking about Mount Doom, because I have so many questions about Mount Doom. So Mount Doom's eruption actually happens in phases, right? So let's kind of break it down. Can you talk about the sound of the magic that creates the sword blade that turns the hilt into a key?
Yeah. So this has kind of been a thing that up until this point in this series we've been hinting at. You see when it first gets discovered and you discover that something's off about it. We've been hinting all these sounds that had to deal with Sauron and evil and sort of that world of sound design. And that was a moment where we could, hit that button again and try to create a connection between who's behind this magic that we're seeing. And, we had a lot of whispery sort of Sauron whisper magic sort of vibey stuff in there, really. And that was a moment to feature that and try to explain, below the radar what's happening with sound design.
Yeah. I mean, really, that moment is the payoff. It's when we realize what it actually is. Like, so before that moment with Waldrick, the corrupted human, corrupted by this thing that we didn't know, and then he uses it as the key, which then I think that moment is the start of a whole lot of things paying off, and also like some monumental sort of events for Middle Earth. So you've got the hilt, but then you've also got the water going into the tunnels. So now we understand what the tunnels were being made for, and then it leads to the eruption of Mount Doom, which continues to erupt into the Third Age, right? And then the destruction of the Southlands and the creation of Mordor, which is the stronghold of evil in Middle Earth. So that starting point with the hilt is everything. It's the first domino that falls in this incredible sort of event in Middle Earth. So it was really important to get that right.
Yeah, really important. So you mentioned the chain reaction, right? That gets set off. So phase 2 is like, you see like this giant sliding stone that's coming out of the rock face, and it causes like this earthquake rock slide thing happening, right? So what were some of your challenges in portraying the size of this event through sound for people that are listening at home on TVs?
That's a cool moment for us because we don't really see what's going on. And it's kind of up to you to figure that out. And within that, there's a lot of freedom, I find. So, the idea of it being some ancient technology that hasn't been turned on in a long time, really making it feel rusty and dry and creaky and screechy in there. And then, like you said, creating the bigness and really placing it in that location. So really, using some EQ and some reverbs and delays and panning and really playing the perspective and the scale. The whole sequence of like Mordor being created, Mount Doom erupting, there's so much perspective. Like you'll go from like on the ground, like in front of the dam, to like super high in the air, to like over here looking down, and then you're on the ground like the size of a mouse and the water's coming at you. So I mean, visually, there's so many perspectives to lean into. And so like when you have the combination of perspective and like a door you can't see what's behind, it's actually pretty easy and free.
Yeah, I think part of the thing specifically with the rocks and the sort of that sense of scale, it's just the frequency content of those sounds actually are kind of full range. So if you're seeing it in a theater with Dolby Atmos, you get more bottom end, but it's like the challenge was, how do we make that sense of scale still play on a TV, TV speakers. And I think the key is the full frequency key sounds, not all the sounds, because then you've got a mess if everything's full frequency all the time, right? So it's about, making sure that those key sounds are heard in like the stereo mix. And Robbie and I have talked about this a bunch of times. It's like the extra time in the schedule that we allowed for Bo and Lindsay to pay special attention to the stereo mix. We would be on the stage and we'd be like, great, this sounds amazing, print it, right? But then we'd take it down to a smaller room on bookshelf speakers. Robbie would be on his headphones next door. Like we'd be constantly sort of checking and double checking, making sure that the translation is going to work. And I think that's something that's a little bit unique to this production, having that amount of time to be able to really, really dial in the 2-track versus the Atmos and the 6 tracks. So very, very happy with the way that translated.
Yes, you can't put a lot of storytelling in the bass, like that in the cinema you can do a lot of that, but in the real world people don't always have a subwoofer, and thinking more about upper lows, lower mids, that frequency range, trying to do as much storytelling in that area. And then the bass is like, it's the cake on top. It's the cherry on top of the cake if you have a subwoofer.
Yeah, I mean, and we, that's from the selection of the sounds to the processing and then the mixing. Like it's sort of every step of the process. You're always going to be thinking about how it's going to translate. But also you want to have a little bit of extra for the people who do have a good sub, right? Like what Robbie said, it's the cherry on top,
Yeah, and there was because the showrunners were actually listening to these mixes in London while we were mixing in New Zealand. So it really forced the hand to like have your client, be watching it in the real world. It's not the cinema. And it makes you work a little extra hard.
And you guys did such a great job. I mean, not only are you mixing for a smaller screen, but you also have to hit the streaming spec. So it's not like theatrical where you can just go big and bold and not have to worry about, hitting a particular spec. You're trying to cram it all in there, pass spec, make it exciting and impactful. So well done. You hit all of those things.
Cool.
Let's skip to the lava bombs, right? So there's this chemical, there's a reaction that happens. The water hits the lava in Mount Doom, and all of a sudden, like, this thing is exploding lava bombs everywhere. cool sound. So what went into the sound of the lava bombs?
I remember the 2 week, because really that sequence came together in about 2 weeks of time, because we know this is coming. We know the shots are going to show up. So you're constantly preparing the sounds you're going to use. And then the day comes where you're looking at the shots. And that 2 week period, my ears were so fried at the end of the day. It was insane. And the whole building was shaking at Department of Post. I mean, it was epic. But, when it came to trying to make this, computer generated stuff feel real and believable, we're always looking for the most relatable sound for what we're trying to tell. So for the sound of the incoming lava bombs, if you will, I reached for jet stuff and, processed that material and gave it, really gnarly Doppler stuff. And I also took some inspiration from, the sort of World War II dive bomb plane sound of like something coming right at you, or the whistle of an incoming artillery. So, taking this fantastical thing, even though explosive volcanoes do happen in real life, they're fantastical to most of us, and relating them to these sounds that we know physically. That was definitely the trick for that sequence. So we have the jet stuff for the incoming, and then, you need this sort of extremely hot, sizzly, frying impact sound. And those sounds actually were created using some software that can manipulate the properties of one sound onto another. And I believe the two sounds that were used to create those are these really concussive, powerful, transient, heavy explosion sounds that are then modulating, like, I believe it's a sponge being dropped into a fryer, just like the most gnarly sizzle fry thing you could imagine. So you end up getting the shape and the energy of this explosion, but the texture and the sort of pitch mod and amplitude modulation that comes from that sizzling sound. And then, putting all of these ingredients into perfect synchronicity where you hear the ripping jet sound coming at you from miles away. And as it's getting closer, if it's going to hit you, you're going to hear a whistle. And so you start to hear that whistle, and then the impact, ultimately the frying, and then coming up with a lot of debris and specific stuff we can have that happen around, a big cloud of dirt. And as interesting as all that stuff is in that sequence, I actually think one of the most powerful elements are the sounds of the people in danger, the men and women and children and soldiers that have been through a lot in this episode and are now dealing with this, and hearing their sort of emotion against all the other stuff I described. To me, that's the through line. And what's interesting is that over the course of that scene, we go into Galadriel's point of view, and we really amp that material up. She's the hero, and she's thinking about the humanity around her, and she's slowing time down and feeling it. And yeah, it's a really fun sequence with a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, I think one of the key it wasn't like a hard rule that we had, but most of the sounds in the entire show are real world sounds, like they've been recorded in the real world, whether they're a jet engine or whatever. That they come, the source is actually from the world, and so the lava bombs and stuff, that because all of that stuff was created from an organic sound. And not used. There were no synths. It's like a warning. There are no synths used in this. No synths were mistreated in this episode. But that was kind of across the entire show. We didn't actually use synths at all, apart from maybe once or twice, just subtle. But we use a few, but not up front. They weren't really used as a foreground element. And so I think that's probably part of why that sequence in particular sounds so good, because they're all quite realistic sounds.
Yeah, and it just grounds those visuals into reality to make you believe it more. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it shows up in interesting ways. Like they're the wide shot when the volcano hits. At last days on the dub stage, a new version of the shot comes in, and there's a flock of birds in the foreground in the trees that fly away. And it's like you see that, and you pop that bird sound in there, and it's just you instantly get it.
Awesome. So I just have one more question for you guys. I got to wrap it up here. But of all the episodes in season 1, why did you choose episode 6 for Emmy consideration?
Some of my favorite moments in the series are small moments and not these big, giant sonic challenges. I like to think that this is sort of the pinnacle of everything we've learned how to do. Like by the time we got to this episode, we really knew what we were doing, and it felt appropriate. It kind of represents most of the sonic challenges of the show, I'd say.
Yeah, look, for me, it was sort of the story of this particular sequence that we're talking about, like the hilt, the orc tunnel, the eruption, and then Mordor being created. Like in terms of the entire Tolkien universe, if you look at all the original films and the Hobbits and this series, it's probably one of the biggest events to be depicted out of all of them. So I think it's probably one of the most important episodes in the entire season, and specifically that sequence. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, great job on the show, and again, congratulations on your Emmy nominations. Best of luck to you this award season.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jen.